This is a production of Cornell University.
Thanks, Megan. And I'm really glad to be here, a little bit of a step down campus from my previous home in natural resources and across campus from the Lab of Ornithology. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about work I've done in both places over the past 8 to 10 years or so, largely focused on keeping an eye towards effective and intentional design of collaborative research endeavors that engage both scientists and members of the public. And to start out, I really just want to illustrate this with a story. And this is a story of one of the scientists I interviewed as part of my dissertation research. His name is Jay Nichols. He's a researcher based at the California Academy of Sciences, but he began researching the severely endangered black sea turtle as an undergraduate and graduate student in the 1980s. And at that point, the turtle's decline was really severe, in part due to overfishing. And where Jay was doing his research in Mexico, turtle fishing had actually just been declared illegal. So there was really basic research that was needed on the turtles into where they were, how many were left, what threats were facing them, what they were eating, where they might be found. And he did find success in answering those questions. But in doing so, he reflected to me as part of my dissertation work that the idea that you collect data, and I'm quoting him here, and then use those data to manage a species at risk or an ecosystem at risk makes sense. But, he went on to say, I was realizing that that's certainly not enough. And not just not enough, but the connection between the science and the conservation action is pretty weak. He said something else needed to happen. Now for Jay, that something else began through partnering with fishermen, with those very people in communities who, by the fate of a changing law, could be referred to as turtle poachers. But they were turtle hunters in communities in Baja who had boats, who knew how and where to find the turtles, and whose cultural heritage and identity were really linked to those turtle populations, and some could say to their survival. So these partnerships that Jay began to build with the communities, with these individuals, grew into a network over a course of a number of years, a network called Grupo Tortuguero, which now conducts regular monthly monitoring of turtle populations. And these monitoring initiatives carried out by local communities now form the basis of scientific data that collaborating scientists can access and have used to publish papers. They've used to leverage those data into conservation action. And communities have begun hosting sea turtle festivals and education events. And all of this together has precipitated changes in harvesting and management practices and the gradual recovery of the sea turtle populations. So it's really difficult to draw a causal connection between the work that Jay has done with these communities and with these individuals and the slow start of a recovery of these turtle populations. But nonetheless, something has happened here that has caused a change. And the work that I've been involved in over the past 8 to 10 years at the Lab of Ornithology has been looking at what potentials there are for change through partnerships with the public towards conservation, among other potential outcomes, and what those elements and drivers of change might be. Some of the things that have been complicating looking into this is that these initiatives that involve the public in scientific research have happened in many different ways, in many different places, and growing out of traditions that haven't had much of a conversation with one another about how this work might be done and done well and done intentionally to achieve desired results. And so to look at what's successful about these partnerships sort of requires defining a space and defining a landscape of what it is that we want to investigate, and then what's shared about those things, and where we also might identify critical differences that can help us understand how these partnerships work. And so I want to talk for a second about terminology, just very briefly, because in the opening and in the title of this talk, it was proposed that the term to describe these partnerships is public participation in scientific research. And that was a term that I was part of a group that coined a number of years back to acknowledge that although the Lab of Ornithology does something called citizen science, there was also research happening in contexts where it's called volunteer monitoring, pro-am partnerships, community-based forestry, that all shared similar characteristics. However, even though we coined that term public participation in scientific research, you're going to hear me today default to using the term citizen science. And this is largely because the community has come around to sharing an appreciation for this term. There are clearly some critiques that we could make of this term and how it's used, but the term has now found its way even into the Oxford English Dictionary. And so while I think it can be pedantic to share a dictionary definition of a term in an academic talk, I'm putting it up here not so much because I'm using that definition, but because it's actually in the dictionary, which is a huge step in saying that this is a thing that exists, a phenomenon that's worthy of attention. And it's actually a decent definition. Scientific work undertaken by members of the public, often, not always, often, in collaboration with or under the direction of professional scientists and scientific institutions. Okay, so citizen science. What is it good for? Let's just start there. When done well, citizen science can give scientists access to data that are otherwise unfeasible to collect. And that can result in significant new scientific insights, such as the landscape scale insights into bird population trends that are modeled here through data collected and shared by amateur bird observers through the Lab of Ornithology's eBird project. So citizen science is about data collection. But citizen science, by its very nature, is also about experiences, and it results in experiences for the observers that are taking part in that project. And this is a photo of Sherman's Creek, a watershed in south central Pennsylvania, where residents in the 1990s began collecting baseline water quality data in the watershed in response to planned development that threatened this resource. And so this was a community that already knew this watershed intimately. It ran through their backyards, it ran through their communities. But through partnerships with scientists at Dickinson College, and through the process of data collection, they came to know that resource also scientifically. And they used those experiences and those data to successfully ban the proposed power plant in their neighborhood. So citizen science has a lot of potential to affect quite a few different outcomes. And taken together, the opportunity to impact both science and learning seems to offer powerful possibilities for conservation action. And in fact, back in 2009, when at the Lab of Ornithology, we did a quick survey of practitioners of citizen science, people who are running and managing citizen science projects, and asked them what their goals were. We found that they were really pretty evenly split between goals for science, goals for education and outreach, and goals for, let's just say, conservation, stewardship, or changing behavior, somehow making an impact on the environment. But we know that achieving any one of these goals, any one of these results through citizen science, or through science itself, requires really careful and intentional work and planning for any given project. And if we reflect for just a moment on the turtle research example that I mentioned from Jay Nichols, I'd like to suggest that Jay's success may be due in a large part because he recognizes that conservation and conservation action doesn't just look and feel like this, like going out and observing the turtles, but conservation action is really a socially embedded process. And whether we want to save the world or a single species, no matter how rigorous or compelling the research itself, no matter how impactful the learning for the individuals who take part, that science and that learning is embedded and surrounded by a social context of people and values and budgets and priorities that also influences decisions when it comes to conservation and change. So citizen science may be, and we suggest can be, a powerful tool in these settings because it can engage both the scientific and the social aspects of conservation questions. But how can we make sure that we think carefully about how to do both of those things well, both the social engagement and the science? So this is coming back to research that I started with colleagues at the Lab of Ornithology and a number of other different institutions back in 2009, 2010, recognizing that many practitioners had goals that fell into three categories. These are articulated slightly differently here, but three categories related to outcomes for science, outcomes for individuals, we can say learning here, and outcomes for social ecological systems, conservation, stewardship, behaviors. We started looking at the way participation might be handled. And this research started in the context of informal science education. So there was an eye particularly towards the outcomes for individuals here, but recognizing that all of these other things also fell into the mix. And through research that was funded by the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, we looked at a number of case studies of National Science Foundation funded citizen science projects to try and relate participation and understand how that public participation in scientific research might influence all of these things. And through that work and some work that I'll talk about in a moment, we came to understand that around that participation, it was important to understand two aspects, both the degree of public participation in the process of research and also the quality of that participation. And let me start with degree. So degree is a fairly simple concept, a question of who participates and in what, or the depth of public involvement in the research process. And so through the case report for NSF, we set up a rubric assuming if you want to accept that the research process of doing science involves all of these steps. And people can argue that you can articulate this in different ways. But for the purposes of this research, we know that science starts with defining a question or an issue, gathering information, developing explanations, collecting data, analyzing data, interpreting results, and asking new questions. And generally, scientists conduct this whole process themselves, but at times, the public can be invited to engage in different steps. Most of the projects that the Lab of Ornithology runs, for example, involve the public at this level, collecting samples, or in the case of birds, making observations and sharing those observations with scientists. But there are some cases out there where individuals can engage in a project in a little bit more of a deeper way, and in fact, even in some cases where they're engaged in the entire research process. The Sherman's Creek example that I mentioned earlier, The community was facilitated by researchers at Dickinson College in defining their own question and the protocols and all the way through interpreting the data and using those data to make change in their communities. So in the case report, we propose the terms for these styles, these approaches to participation as contributory, collaborative, and co-created. I wouldn't concern yourselves with those terms terribly much, except that I'm going to use them in the graph that follows to illustrate the kinds of outcomes that we were starting to see associated with each approach. Now, I have to say that data on the outcomes of these partnerships are really limited. There's not a lot of research that's been done, particularly into the learning outcomes, let alone the conservation outcomes of citizen science projects, particularly any that can draw clear causal connections. But those data that are available really were starting to suggest to us that those contributory projects, those where participants were involved at the level of collecting data through a protocol designed by scientists, where scientists were using and analyzing those data to answer a scientific question, were really particularly well suited, as one might expect, to be providing data for good, rigorous, peer-reviewed publications. But those that seem to be having the greatest impact on public learning and on conservation action fell more in this category. Now, that's not to say that these other outcomes didn't happen through these other approaches to participation. It's just that it may be more difficult or fewer data were available. And again, this was largely coming from research that was focused on understanding the informal science education outcomes, but it came out at a time that several other publications were appearing with very similar typologies of participation. For example, Finn Danielson out of the Monitoring Matters Network in Copenhagen articulated very similar categories of participation using different terms and reviewed over 100 participatory monitoring research initiatives around the globe and came up with very similar results. Those where the public were largely involved in collecting data yielded precise and accurate data. However, decision making was slower. There was lower potential for influencing the capacity of, he was looking at stakeholders in the decision making process. With the flip side on the co-created style of engagement with higher potential for prompt decision making and stakeholder capacities. However, expectations for data precision and accuracy might be a little bit lower depending on how that was handled. Importantly, however, Danielson and colleagues pointed out that this was an area where you had to think not just about the degree of public participation, but also about the quality of participation. And so while the degree of participation is fairly easy to quantify, quality is more subjective and context relevant, having to do with things along the lines of trust and fairness and credibility. And Danielson and others, and some of my work published in Ecology and Society, draws on participation theory, where there's a real rich and deep literature that looks at assumptions which would be easy to make looking at the implications of the degree of participation. It really challenges assumptions that more participation is better participation, and really forces the question of asking whose interests are being served and to what end, and also how those interests are balanced in the design of a project. And I just want to give you two brief examples where you can think there might be some disparity between the degree of participation and the quality of participation. And here I'm going to call on our eBird project again, where the data collection happens at such a large geographic scale that it would seem to minimize project leaders' ability to impact the experiences of the volunteers in any meaningful way. And that can, in fact, be difficult to do when the geographic scale is so huge. The project approach that makes the most sense is that contributory approach. You ask a lot of people to share a little bit of data, and it all adds up and makes a big difference. But what about the experience and the quality of participation? Well, just as one example, I want to harken back to the early days of eBird when participation in the project itself was really sort of stumbling along in the early 2000s, the first few years of the project, where even though we had leveraged the support of a high-profile marketer to get the word out about eBird in all the right journals, to tell people to share their brains with science, contribute your data, and help make a difference to scientific researchers at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, nothing happened. But in about 2006, with the launch of what at that time was called eBird 2.0, a critical shift was made in the way the project was rolled out and talked about, with a recognition that the birders who were out there making those high-quality observations, they didn't really care what the scientists were going to do with those data, but they'd love a place where they could archive their life lists. And once we started marketing eBird as a service, once we considered the quality of the participation for those volunteers, what they would get out of it, why they would want to take part, observations and contributions really skyrocketed. Just as another really quick example of a project that unfortunately has folded in the past number of years, in Canada, there was a nationwide set of protocols that really asked people to make basic observations of something of interest, plants, ice out, frogs, and then engage the local communities in different areas in asking questions about what they were concerned about in their environment, in their communities, and invited them to use some of these protocols to help address those concerns. And there's a lot that could be talked about here, but I want to point out that what I found most compelling, one of the things that I found most compelling about this project at the time when they were publishing was that where most projects in the US were focused on data quality, high precision, accurate data, and could citizen science do this? They were asking, this project was asking, are those data timely? Are they accessible to the people who need them? Are they relevant in the communities where they can make a difference? And are they ultimately useful? So how can we start a conversation about these kinds of qualities with the people who are engaged in citizen science and public participation in scientific research to better understand the kinds of data and the kinds of experiences and the kinds of participation that can make a difference when it comes to conservation. So just briefly, I'm going to show you a common framework that we've articulated for the design of citizen science projects. And I don't want to belabor this, but I do want to point out that a common logic model can help us think about how and why we design projects to get to particular outcomes. And that through citizen science, what we're suggesting right now is that it really demands a consideration of both scientific interest and public interest at the outset in identifying the question or issue to be addressed, and that this kind of conversation will influence how the research protocols and trainings are developed and the kinds of experiences that are had by volunteers, as well as the kinds of observations that they're going to make. And we have already talked about how that can yield a wide range of different kinds of outcomes. And through this framework, we can start to better understand how those inputs can affect the outcomes. But here's where I want to focus in a little bit more on conservation itself as a concept. And this is because in the field of conservation, there's more focused attention in the past number of years on conservation evaluation. How do we know that we're achieving the desired goals for conservation? And Margulis and colleagues in that field have really started to push people to more clearly identify conservation targets and articulate when you say you want to affect conservation, what is it very specifically that you want to change, and how do you think you're going to get there through the work that you're doing? So they're asking people to articulate both conservation targets and pathways. And here's a really, loose example. We can say that through citizen science, we're going to collect data that's going to influence science, and that somehow that's going to affect conservation. We know we need to do better than that. And so what are the theories that we have around how citizen science, very specifically how citizen science might be making a difference for particular conservation targets? And here's where I want to share a little snapshot of some of the research I've done through my dissertation research, where I've talked to scientists about the work that they've done in projects that they've committed their careers to in many cases. Because this is difficult work. Engaging the public really is not easy, and it's risky. And so what significance and potential might scientists be seeing that would really influence their commitment to citizen science, to weather the critiques and pursue this difficult work? I mentioned that I talked to scientists. I did in-depth narrative interviews with 9 individuals who were, in many cases, high-profile scientists. Terry Root is a Nobel laureate for her work with the IPCC on climate change. And I asked them, in a lot of different ways, why it was that they were doing what they were doing, and how it was that their science, that their citizen science worked, and what it was that they were affecting. And not to get into the details here, but what I heard from them were many different conservation targets, a wide diversity of conservation targets that fell into categories for science. Yes, they were doing this because they needed the science, they needed the data, but because they also saw potentials for changing the experiences of individuals, and because they saw potentials for changing conservation. And so drawing on the work of Margulis and et al. To identify conservation targets and also identify pathways to those targets, I worked with the narratives of these scientists to start to look at how their experiences were suggesting that their work could affect their desired conservation outcomes. Now, I do want to point out that I'm not suggesting that this is actually how it works, but how they saw it work. There's a lot more research that needs to be done to see if these pathways are actually successful. But I want to share just 2 of them with you, and it's these 2 that I've circled here. One is from Jay Nichols, who I mentioned earlier. And here I'll just share a quote from his interview. He said, following the excerpt that I shared earlier, you can't just create the knowledge and hand it off and just expect action from the authorities. Here he's talking about management agencies, because they just don't have the capacity to do that. If we keep expecting them to take the reports and the data and turn it into action, it's kind of a ridiculous dream. And it's been a bit of a dream all along. I think it's pretty clear to people that the way it's going to work is for people to use this knowledge themselves and create movement or action or change or whatever it is that they're after. So this is what Jay saw as the potential for citizen science, in part because of a practical theory that was telling him that the data and the management agencies weren't going to do it. And the pathway that he articulated related to citizen science was this: that community members, by being involved in data collection, were creating knowledge that they themselves had access to. And that by defining goals related to that knowledge for sea turtle protection, they would take knowledge based on that science to create change. Now, I did mention that I can't say that this is actually the way it's happening, but I can say that it's not unfounded. Jay's work has resulted in communities making change in marine protected areas where they are residents. And so there's reason to really consider that this level of engagement can result in actual use of knowledge, use of science, and science-based action for management. So I just want to share another pathway to illustrate a different kind of conservation change. And this is from Bill McShay. Bill's a landscape ecologist based at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in Northern Virginia, where he's done work to understand mammal populations and their influence on grasslands throughout Northern Virginia and in other ecosystems around the world. In Northern Virginia, he said to me, if you really want to do conservation on that ecosystem, you got to be working with private landowners. Remember, this is Northern Virginia. Most of the landscape in that area that's grassland is held by private individuals. He went on to say, and they're antsy about government people and official workers. They seem to be much more receptive to citizens, to the general public, to the birding club. They seem to like that better than the government's going to send a team of people onto your land to see what you've got. So it seems to work best. And it, in this case, was Bill working with volunteers to go onto these private lands to do point counts of bird populations, to do butterfly monitoring surveys. And while they were there, here's the pathway that Bill saw as happening between that interaction. So this is the point he wants to get to, that the landowners implement grassland restoration practices, and here's how he saw it happening. He needed to conduct surveys. The private landowners allow access to citizen volunteers, not to the government people, but to the citizen volunteers. And while they're there, the landowners talk to them. They ask them what they're doing, why are they doing it? And that information, that informal sharing of information, both the science and the context of conservation, has more of an impact than visits from state employees, resulting in, Bill theorizes, and in some cases has seen, changes in their actual management of their lands. So, these are just a few possibilities that really suggest that attention to the social dimension of citizen science, of public participation in scientific research, attention to the public interests, to the degree and the quality of participation, as well as the scientific needs, not instead of, but as well as the scientific needs, can be a step towards conservation. And importantly, a step that is commensurate with the science and not in opposition to it. And I'd like to suggest that these insights can invite us to think both more critically and more expansively about concepts like public engagement, a concept that's a key mission of our own institution. And public engagement can mean many things to many different people. It can mean research that is shared with the public, scientific knowledge that's disseminated to the public. But I'd also like to suggest that public engagement can effectively involve inviting participants to be part of the research process. This does have to be done carefully. It does have to be done where it's appropriate to do so. Not all science is appropriate for citizen science or for public engagement, but in places where it is and where there's a potential for that to have an impact, the evidence is suggesting to us that more than just the science must be considered if we are to get to conservation action through that research. And I want to wrap up with something that may seem to be at first like a little bit of a non sequitur. And that is that back in 2011, I helped convene a 60-person workshop at the American Museum of Natural History, which was examining citizen science and conservation, called Engaging and Learning for Conservation Through Public Participation in Scientific Research. And there were a lot of great insights that came out of that event as to what the potential of citizen science was and how to work together. But through evaluation, we also gained some insights into the practitioner community themselves. And here's one that I want to share just because it was so telling in its honesty. And this was shared by presumably a scientist who was in attendance there, a conservation scientist anonymous, said, even though it makes me uncomfortable after this event, I'm thinking about ways to communicate and interact on a regular and frequent basis with the science education community. And one of the reasons that I'm sharing this is that if we have a hard time interacting with our colleagues across campus, that can make it even more difficult and daunting to think about interacting with the public effectively. And so I'd like to suggest that as this conversation about public participation in scientific research grows, and as the field expands, which it is, that it demands that we step outside of our comfort zones, not just with the public, but with our colleagues, and making this a truly interdisciplinary practice. Because both Jay and Bill and the other scientists that I interviewed for my research, they're not working in a vacuum, they're not working alone, they're working with colleagues to share insights as to how to effectively engage the public in new and potentially different ways to do both science and conservation. As an aside, just before I close with a few questions, I will note if anybody's interested in this opportunity to engage across disciplines and engage with other colleagues who are involved in public participation in scientific research, there's a conference being held in San Jose, a pre-conference of the AAAS annual meeting on citizen science. And our call for proposals has just closed, unfortunately, but we did receive over 400 proposals for talks at that conference. So it's shaping up to be a really important event and well attended. So I actually want to close with some questions that were offered by Megan, and I'm going to put her on the spot here because when we were corresponding in advance of my coming here to give this talk, she was suggesting some questions that really resonated with thinking that I have, and asking ourselves as a community, how might we do things like develop opportunities where appropriate for public participation in scientific research? How can we consider both the science and the conservation possibilities of citizen science? And lastly, and this I think is maybe one of the most important things as this field grows and people step into this practice, how can both students and faculty be supported in engaging thoughtfully and effectively in a practice that can go against some of the traditions and expectations, particularly in academic departments, to do things in new and different ways to achieve the results that presumably we all want to achieve for conservation through our science. So I will close there. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to repeat the question just for the benefit of Geneva and the camera. Why conservation? Aren't there other potential outcomes that are just as relevant and just as engaging? Did I get that right? And that's a great question. And I really should have given a little bit more context in the beginning that this is my personal bias. I was doing my research largely in relationship to informal science education and conservation. But the field of citizen science is much, much broader. In fact, there is work now coming into conversation under the term citizen science, and it's really important to acknowledge that that term citizen science is now being used to understand activities that haven't always fallen under that terminology. But there's research now that's being discussed under that term in public health, for example. Certainly a long history in astronomy research, in water quality monitoring. So conservation, yes, is one, you're right, very timely, topical point of conversation. It happens to be an area, and we can talk about why this might be, but an area where a large number of citizen science projects have been focused. And increasingly, citizen science is now showing up in or moving into areas like microbiology, neurobiology even, but that's fairly recent. But yeah, conservation is one action-oriented and social scientific, just one example of change. Yeah, that's a great question that Don asked about have there been any studies to corroborate the accuracy of citizen science data? I'll offer two answers to that. One is yes, hundreds. But the other answer is the only study that matters is the one that you do for your project. because what matters is the design of a given project. Does it meet the goals that you set out for your project, whatever those might be? Now, a core need of that is that citizen science is science. There are some things that have been called citizen science that really we could make an argument is largely just education work, and the science that results is secondary. Education is important, engagement in science is important, but citizen science really has that core of useful, usable scientific data. Now, the usefulness of those data may not show up for many years, that's possible, but the science is important. Any given project is going to have to go through the difficult work of making sure that their project is designed in such a way that it can produce those usable data. But yeah, there are hundreds of papers for individual discrete projects that do show that. Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, does the public have a skew or a bias towards certain organisms or topics? And you know, one of the lab of ornithology, I'll say in some ways, was very lucky in its history with citizen science, because there were a lot of people already bird watching, a lot of highly skilled people already bird watching, and our scientists very astutely were able to capitalize on that. There are certainly other taxa for which it has been more difficult to design citizen science projects. And some of the reasons that we started the work that we've done at the Lab of Ornithology to look at the practice more broadly of citizen science was because we were getting asked questions by people saying, I want to design eBird for seahorses, for example. I want to design citizen science for jellyfish. And we were realizing that you can't just take an if you build it they will come approach to citizen science, because that's certainly not the case. However, there are now projects that are successfully engaging people in doing things like folding proteins. There's a project called Fold It, which I've just started playing with, and I don't understand exactly how people get turned on to it yet, but it's gamifying. There's a learning curve, so you really have to commit to it. And yes, any project is going to attract a certain subset of people who have a particular affinity for doing a certain thing. But projects have been successful in enticing people to do protein folding, to look at jellyfish, to do a wide range of things. And the onus is on the project developers to really find out what those public interests are and how you can make your project resonate with the people you're hoping to involve in it. Or vice versa, understand where there's already attention going on to something that's of interest to you, like with birds, and see how you can capitalize on that interest. I will just caution, though, that I think you mentioned something about school. That some of my early research was on student science partnerships, and could students effectively be motivated to collect accurate data? And there's a sort of one step removed question there about, or assumption about motivation, which is that students, when they're in a classroom, are a captive audience. Yes, they'll be there to take part in the activities, but the motivation is probably going to be more along the lines of, I'm doing it because my teacher said so. And yes, you will find some that you will be able to excite about it who might not have been excited had they not been exposed to it through school. But school is not necessarily a guarantee of some kind of motivation. Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't put data in there just because I was trying to make the extreme results as visible as possible. But I will also say that one thing I want to make very clear is that those were typologies that were developed just to help us get a handle on the landscape of what was happening. And no one project is a hard and fast contributory project, for example, or co-created project. Projects can be designed to offer primarily a contributory experience or primarily a co-created experience, but individuals can engage in a project in a wide range of approaches based on how engaged they may choose to be. So for example, in the Sherman's Creek example, where the community was engaged in water quality monitoring, there were some people who really just collected the data. They showed up and they collected the data. And it was a smaller number of people who did the whole process of data analysis, protocol development, and so forth. So those aren't hard and fast categories. The lines are slippery and blurry between them, and it really was a rubric for trying to draw some general conclusions that would allow us to understand the landscape. So that's in a way that's a dodge of your question, but I hope it gives you a more helpful answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, our time is up, and I want to thank Dr. Shirk for a fascinating presentation. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks for the chance to talk.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.